that he believed he had found the answer. Not in wealth, not in intellect, not even in legacy, but in something quieter. Something people ignore until they're desperate enough to ask, why am I alive? This isn't about Tolstoy, the writer. It's about Tolstoy, the man who stood on the edge of existence and asked himself if living was still worth it. At the peak of his fame, Leo Tolstoy was a global icon. He had everything: applause from critics, influence over nations, and books that would outlive generations. But inside, a silence that screamed, an emptiness so vast it made him question not just his purpose, but life itself. This is the journey of a man who dismantled his own life in search of truth. And the question he wrestled with is the same one many of us carry, but rarely voice. If everything ends, why bother beginning at all? Tolstoy wasn't just experiencing a rough patch. This was a full-scale existential collapse. He described it as if the ground beneath him vanished and nothing, not his art, not his fame, not even his family, could keep him from free-falling. At one point, he was so desperate that he hid ropes and weapons from himself, fearing what he might do in a moment of clarity too raw to survive. He scoured reason for answers. He consumed science, hoping to decode the machinery of the universe and find something, anything, that could justify suffering, death, and the fragile joy between them. But the more he read, the colder it got. Science could tell him how a tree grows, but not why it exists, and that's when it broke him. When you realize that no amount of success can save you from meaninglessness, it doesn't matter how many people admire you. Tolstoy realized that all the things he worked so hard to build, his reputation, his stories, his place in history, were just shadows on the wall. One gust of time, and they'd all be gone. So he turned his gaze to something most intellectuals of his status would sneer at: the poor. Not because they had what he lacked materially, but because they had what he couldn't fake: a quiet kind of peace. He watched peasants who woke up every day to backbreaking labor, with no prestige, no legacy, no war and peace to their name, and yet they weren't plagued by despair. They believed in something, not intellectually, viscerally. Was that faith? Was that ignorance? Or was that a deeper kind of wisdom, the kind you don't learn in books? Tolstoy started asking dangerous questions, questions that make the comfortable squirm. What if the problem wasn't the lack of meaning, but the way we look for it? What if the very tools we use to build our lives, status, logic, accolades, are the exact things that keep us from meaning? He dug into religion next, not the rituals he'd grown up around, but the essence, the core, the raw teachings, the message buried under centuries of power and politics. He stripped Christianity down to the bones. No incense, no clergy, just the raw words of Jesus. Love your neighbor, reject wealth, turn the other cheek. And suddenly things started clicking. This wasn't about belief, it was about how you live. He wasn't done though. Tolstoy didn't stop at Christianity. He went east. Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Islam. He consumed them all, looking for a thread that connected these worldviews. And in almost everyone, he found the same truth staring back. You are not the center of the universe. The ego lies. Desire binds. And true peace is found not in attaining, but in letting go. But Tolstoy still wasn't ready to surrender. This man was used to controlling narratives. This wasn't a story he could write. This was one he had to live. So he did something that most people never dare. He changed. Radically, publicly, permanently. He gave up his luxurious lifestyle. He started working in the fields. He dressed like the people he once wrote about from a distance. He gave away his money. He renounced his copyrights. He rejected the aristocracy that raised him and the church that once baptized him. People thought he was mad. He had everything, and he threw it away. But what they couldn't see is that he wasn't throwing it away. He was letting go of the things that had held him hostage. This was more than a spiritual phase. It was a metamorphosis. He no longer asked, "What is the meaning of life?" in an abstract sense. Instead, he asked, "How can I live in a way that makes life meaningful?" There's a moment he wrote about, watching peasants gather for prayer after a long day of brutal work. No ceremony, no preaching, just silence, reverence, gratitude. And he realized these people weren't blind. They were anchored to something eternal, something the intellect couldn't touch. So he stopped trying to understand life and started trying to serve it. Tolstoy's new belief wasn't pretty. It wasn't easy. It demanded action. He started writing again, not grand novels of war and nobility, but piercing stories that dug into death, truth, and conscience. Stories like The Death of Ivan Ilyich, where a man realizes on his deathbed that he's wasted his entire life chasing approval instead of authenticity. And this is where the script takes a turn, because Tolstoy's answer wasn't a theory, it was a practice. He said the sole meaning of life is to serve humanity, not because it earns you salvation, but because it breaks the illusion that you're alone. Here's the part that hurts. Many of us are waiting for clarity before we act. We wait to find purpose before we change. But Tolstoy flipped that. He acted his way into clarity, and maybe that's the only way clarity ever comes. We live in a world obsessed with self-care, self-worth, self-branding. But what if the self isn't the answer? What if the self is the question, and the answer is in what we give away? What if the people we envy aren't the ones with more, but the ones who need less? And that brings us to the next stage of his journey, where the philosophy wasn't just a belief system, it became the engine of everything he did. By now, Tolstoy had stopped playing by society's rules. He didn't care if his peers called him a fool. He was no longer chasing their applause. He was chasing something real. And that's when the real backlash began. His wife, Sophia, couldn't understand what he was doing. They had children. They had a legacy to protect. Why throw away everything he built? She saw a man unraveling. But he wasn't unraveling. He was shedding. Tolstoy believed that if you claim to have found truth, your life should scream it even when your mouth is shut. So he kept walking the talk. He gave up legal ownership of his works. He rejected inheritance laws. He refused to profit off his name. He became a spiritual insurgent in a culture that measured worth by estates and etiquette, and that made him dangerous. The church excommunicated him. The state feared him. Censors mutilated his work. But Tolstoy didn't fight back with anger. He just kept writing, kept walking barefoot into truth, even when the path cut his feet. His later books weren't novels. They were provocations. The kingdom of God is within you wasn't a metaphor. It was a blueprint for rebellion, not with violence, but with radical inner freedom. In it, he argued that true Christianity isn't about attending rituals, but about living in a way that makes injustice impossible. This idea didn't just rattle Russia, it echoed around the world. A young Indian lawyer named Gandhi read Tolstoy's words and called it a revolution. The idea that love and nonviolence could dismantle empires wasn't just theory anymore. It became practice, and the world would never be the same. But while his words inspired millions, Tolstoy's personal life was falling apart. His family saw him as a traitor to their class. His estate, once a symbol of success, now felt like a prison. And in his final years, the tension grew unbearable. At 82, he did something no one expected. In the middle of the night, with no fanfare, Tolstoy left. No plan, no destination. just a satchel and a will to die free. He boarded a train heading south. Maybe he was looking for a monastery. Maybe he just wanted silence. But his body couldn't keep up with his soul. He collapsed at a tiny station called Ostapovo, barely a blip on the map. No mansions, no mourners, just cold floors and candlelight. There, surrounded by strangers, Russia's greatest writer took his final breath. Not in a palace, not in his study, but in a station master's room, wearing plain clothes, far from everything he once thought mattered. And yet, it was perfect, because he didn't die as Count Tolstoy. He died as a man who refused to lie to himself, even when it cost him everything. So what now? What does this have to do with us? It's easy to hear stories like this and turn them into symbols. It's harder to ask the uncomfortable questions they leave behind. Questions like, are you building a life you'll believe in on your deathbed? What would it look like to live not for applause, but for truth? Tolstoy's story reminds us that clarity doesn't come wrapped in epiphanies. It comes in moments where we stop distracting ourselves, stop pretending, stop chasing things that die when we do. He didn't have a final answer. He had a final direction. Live for something bigger than yourself. Maybe that's faith. Maybe it's service. Maybe it's love. But whatever it is, it can't be bought, branded, or banked. It's earned in silence, in sacrifice, in showing up when no one's clapping. Tolstoy taught us that life doesn't hand you meaning. You forge it with the way you treat people, the courage to question norms, and the humility to start over. You don't need to renounce everything like Tolstoy, but you do need to ask, what am I refusing to let go of, even though it's costing me peace? Maybe it's the job that flatlines your soul, the image you built to protect your insecurities, the silence you keep to avoid rocking the boat. Whatever it is, let this be the moment you stop running from the question and start living like the answer matters. Because it does. And if a man like Tolstoy, who had the world at his feet, could still lie awake at night asking why, then maybe we're not broken for doing the same. Maybe we're human. His life was a question, his death a kind of answer. But the real point isn't to quote him, it's to wrestle with the questions he left behind. So I'll leave you with this. What would your life look like if you stopped pretending and started living as if the meaning is something you create, right now, with every choice you make? If this hit you in the gut, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not because it's poetic, but because it's honest. And in a world that rewards noise, honesty is the loudest thing we've got. See you in the next one.